The sound of crystal glasses gently clinking together rang out like a clear melody, mingling with the deep laughter of men in tuxedos and the high-pitched voices of ladies draped in glittering evening gowns. A grand chandelier hung high above, casting thousands of reflections that rained down like a brilliant meteor shower across the elegant ballroom. The scent of aged red wine blended in the air with expensive perfume, a fragrance that was both luxurious and stifling. At the large table in the center of the room sat Arthur Sterling, the real estate mogul, completely still. The man well into his 60s had perfectly combed salt and pepper hair, a tailored navy suit, and a tightly knotted tie. In this world, he was the ruler. One signature from him could decide the fate of an entire neighborhood. A single nod could move hundreds of millions of dollars in an instant. In his hand was a glass of vintage Bordeaux. He took a small sip, his cold eyes scanning the room filled with those who fancied themselves the masters of the city. No one dared meet his gaze for more than 3 seconds. Arthur's presence was both intimidating and awe-inspiring. The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium. Clack! Sunrise on the Seine is sold for $18 million, the host announced clearly. The hall erupted in enthusiastic applause, but to Arthur it was all just empty numbers. He was used to watching people burn through money like paper. The restaurant manager approached and bowed respectfully. "Mr. Sterling, your bill." A slip of paper was placed before him. A small detail. A routine gesture no one usually noticed. But in that moment, everything changed. Arthur glanced at it. At first, he intended to wave it off. A bill, something trivial, not worth his attention. But then, his eyes froze on the bottom corner of the paper. A signature. The ink had smudged, faded with time, but it was hauntingly familiar. Arthur picked up the slip of paper. His hand trembled slightly. His heart, the same heart that had weathered billion-dollar deals without flinching, now pounded like a war drum. A memory struck like lightning. A rainy afternoon long ago. A girl with dark hair and a radiant smile handing him a letter. And at the bottom of that letter, that very same signature. He had been searching for it for 40 years. The room blurred around him. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the sound of the auction all vanished. Only the pounding of his heart remained heavy and relentless. Arthur shot to his feet. His chair toppled behind him. The paper in his hand shook uncontrollably. The elite guests turned to look, their expressions startled. Some whispered. Some exchanged confused glances. "Mr. Sterling, is everything all right?" asked an investor beside him. Voice cautious. Arthur didn't answer. His lips moved, whispering words meant for no one but himself. "No. It can't be. Her signature." A single tear fell tracing down his angular face, landing on the gold ring he always wore on his finger. The first tear in decades. A young waiter standing just a few steps away went pale. He fumbled nervously, unable to understand how one piece of paper had just brought the city's most powerful man to his knees. Arthur clenched the bill tightly, his eyes red with emotion. In that grand, glittering room surrounded by murmurs and hundreds of curious stares, the real estate titan began to cry. No one understood. No one dared to approach. Just a simple receipt. An old, faded signature. How could it break a man who once treated this city like a chessboard in the palm of his hand? The question hung in the air. And the answer, buried deep within a secret he'd kept hidden for 40 years, was about to change everything. The evening carried on beneath the golden glow of dozens of chandeliers. The restaurant walls were adorned with abstract paintings, each worth a fortune. The red carpet was so thick it seemed to swallow the sound of footsteps. Everything here was designed to flaunt wealth, but also to hide the truth. This was all a stage where the powerful paraded their opulent masks. Arthur Sterling, seated on an Italian leather chair, looked every bit a king on his throne. He ruled a real estate empire that spanned the coastal states. Towering glass buildings bearing the name Sterling Tower pierced the sky, standing as monuments to his unmatched power. Everyone in the industry knew a single frown from Arthur could bring a project crashing down. People looked at him with two simultaneous emotions, fear and desire. Fear because no one wanted to be his enemy. Desire because everyone longed to stand close enough to catch a glimmer of the light he radiated. Tonight was no different. At the auction, every time Arthur gave the slightest nod or raised an eyebrow, those seated nearby took note, studied him, and later recounted it like legend at other gatherings. He was the shark in a sea full of opportunists. The wine in his hand shimmered a deep crimson. He sipped it slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the room. On that face, no one could read emotion, only see the power forged through decades of battles. But no one knew that beneath that cold steel armor was a heart that once burned with love, that once knew loss. For Arthur, life had long since been reduced to numbers, revenue stocks, profits. But deep in his memory, a piece of the past remained unresolved. And tonight, that missing piece had resurfaced, tucked inside a crumpled slip of paper. Across from all that dazzling light stood a figure in stark contrast, Ethan Reed, the young waiter. The white shirt on his back had faded after dozens of rushed washes. The cuffs were frayed. His black shoes were polished, but the toes were scuffed. In his hands, a heavy silver tray, always carried with tense caution, afraid of dropping something he couldn't afford to replace. Ethan was 27, but his eyes looked older. Dark circles sat permanently beneath his lids, evidence of countless night shifts. In his pocket was a small notebook where he tracked every expense, rent, utilities, his sister's tuition. The tips from customers were his lifeline, and they were never enough. The people in that grand hall never saw him as a person. To them, Ethan was just a hand that served wine, a shadow waiting silently on the sidelines, invisible in their world of luxury. He had grown used to being overlooked, to the impatient frowns when he poured too slowly, to the quiet but razor-sharp reprimands. Still, he kept going, because there was no other choice. Outside, New York City shimmered with millions of lights, each one a dream in the making. But inside a rundown apartment in Brooklyn, his younger sister Lily waited with her textbooks. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, but the looming cost of tuition hung over them like a sword. To Ethan, every dollar saved was a breath of air, one step closer to his sister's future. Tonight, he just wanted to get through his shift, collect his meager tips, and go home. He had no idea that the scrap of paper he'd grabbed in a hurry from an old box in his apartment, just something to jot down an order, would be the spark that ignited his entire world. On an invisible scale, Arthur Sterling and Ethan Reed stood at opposite ends. On one side, opulence, power, everything within reach. On the other, poverty, invisibility, a life spent with head bowed in service. These two men were never meant to cross paths. And yet fate had chosen a crumpled piece of paper, a mistaken receipt, as the thread to tie their worlds together. While Arthur lived among sycophants and yes-men, Ethan existed as a shadow. But it is from that very shadow that a terrifying truth is about to emerge. Tonight, the line between power and powerlessness will be torn apart. Arthur sat frozen, his eyes locked on the signature in the corner of the receipt. Memories surged violently through his mind. He remembered the delicate hand that once held the pen, the shy smile of the girl from long ago, and the day he walked away trading love for ambition. Ethan stood just a few steps away, a growing sense of unease knotting in his chest. He couldn't understand why a man like Arthur would tremble over a meaningless piece of paper. Around them, the murmurs began. A few guests chuckled quietly, assuming the tycoon had finally grown old, confused. No one in that glittering room could have known that in that fleeting moment, a past buried for 40 years was about to rise from the dead. Arthur Sterling, the man who had everything yet lost, what mattered most to the world. Arthur Sterling was a monument in steel cold, unwavering, untouchable. The press called him the king of concrete. In every Forbes cover photo, he stood with arms crossed, eyes staring straight into the lens framed by the glass towers that bore his name. But no one knew that when night fell and the city lights began to fade in the penthouse on the 70th floor of Sterling Tower, Arthur often sat alone by the massive glass window pouring drink after drink, his eyes empty, fixed on the horizon. Hidden behind a Picasso painting in his office was a safe. Inside, among dozens of project files, there was a small compartment he hadn't touched in 40 years. It didn't hold cash or stocks, but a single old photograph, a young woman with a radiant smile standing in a field of wild daisies. Her name, Elena Morales, Arthur's first love, and his last. Back then, Arthur was just a young architecture graduate, full of dreams of building structures that reached the sky. Elena came from a poor Spanish immigrant family and worked as a waitress in a tiny Brooklyn cafe. They met one summer afternoon when Arthur brought in a stack of blueprints, and Elena flustered spilled coffee all over them. Her shy apology, paired with a smile brighter than the sun, melted the young man's heart. They fell in love quickly, passionately, innocently. Elena wrote Arthur handwritten letters instead of speaking her feelings aloud. "I want my words to carry emotion so you can reread them when you're lonely," she said. Every letter ended with her carefully penned signature, E. Morales, followed by a tiny 5-pointed star. To Arthur, that star became a symbol of the light she brought into his life. But as Arthur's career ambitions grew closer to reality, he began to change. The romantic promises gave way to investor meetings. Elena, with her simple cotton dresses, began to feel out of place among women in glittering gowns and diamond earrings. Their final argument came on a rainy night. Elena handed him a long letter, her handwriting shaky with tears. At the bottom, her usual signature. But Arthur never read it. He folded it up, stuffed it into his pocket, and walked away, muttering, "I need a future, not a fantasy." By morning, Elena was gone. No trace, no word. No one knew where she went. The letter disappeared too. And from that day forward, Arthur buried himself in work, building the Sterling Empire with relentless ambition, yet also with an emptiness he could never fill. Every time he poured a glass of wine, he thought of that smile, and every time he remembered another small crack formed in his heart. Ethan Reed, the waiter, carrying the weight of family. If Arthur Sterling embodied the peak of power, Ethan Reed was the stark reflection of how fragile life could be at society's lowest rung. Ethan was born in a poor Brooklyn neighborhood. His father walked out when he was just 3. His mother, Isabella Reed, was an unknown painter who survived by hurriedly selling oil paintings at small market stalls. Every night, Ethan would see her sitting by the window, the warm yellow light casting shadows on her thin hands as she painted in silence. As he grew older, he realized she didn't paint to sell, she painted to preserve memories. In their cramped apartment, there was a wooden box with a broken lock. Ethan once opened it out of curiosity and found old letters, a small bundle of hair tied with ribbon, and a carefully folded piece of paper with a signature that felt oddly familiar, E. Morales. At the time, he was too young to understand its value. His mother quickly snatched it away, her face momentarily clouded like a chill drifting through a warm room. Ethan grew up in scarcity. He once dreamed of studying graphic design, but tuition costs forced him to drop out. Instead, he worked wherever he could, cafes, fast food joints, and eventually a high-end restaurant frequented by Arthur Sterling himself. Every night after long shifts, Ethan returned to their tiny apartment, his hands sore and blistered from carrying trays. He'd then sit down and help his younger sister Lily with her studies. He wouldn't allow himself to collapse. He knew if he gave up, Lily would have no one left. Yet deep down, one question always haunted him. Who was his father? Why had his mother never told him? And why every time he mentioned that old letter did her eyes glaze over with tears before she quietly turned away? In the middle of the opulent room, Arthur clutched the receipt with trembling hands. That signature, E. Morales, with a tiny star at the end, was identical to the ones etched into the old letters seared into his memory. His heart tightened as if being pulled backward through time 40 years into the past. From a distance, Ethan noticed the look on Arthur's face, and a strange, inexplicable dread stirred within him. That piece of paper. It was the one he'd pulled from the old wooden box in his apartment. Earlier that morning, needing scrap paper to jot down an order, he'd grabbed it in a rush, not realizing what it truly was. It was the lost letter. The one that disappeared the night Elena vanished. Fate was cruel. A single sheet of paper, a tiny forgotten detail, had somehow become the bridge connecting two lives separated by an entire world. Arthur was shaken to his core, seeing the ghost of a lost love rise before him. Ethan, meanwhile, stood frozen in fear, unable to comprehend why that scrap of paper had brought the city's most powerful man to tears. And in that moment, neither of them knew the truth. They were not just strangers brought together by chance. Blood memory and a long-buried truth were quietly rising to the surface, a truth that would change everything. Arthur gripped the paper tightly, his heart threatening to shatter. Elena's image. His Elena rose vividly before him. He could hear her laughter, the sound of her footsteps running through the fields, even the faint scent of daisies drifting in the breeze. Ethan, just a few steps away, saw only one thing: danger. That kind of power could crush him with a snap of its fingers. One wrong move and he could lose everything. But the look in Arthur's eyes, panic tangled with pain, sent a chill down his spine. In that moment, neither man yet realized they were about to collide not just over a piece of paper, but over the secrets that had quietly imprisoned their entire lives. The music in the banquet hall still played a spontaneous jazz piece, the saxophone winding through the air like curling smoke. Crystal glasses clinked softly against one another, creating the familiar background symphony of the elite. But at the long, white-draped table where Arthur Sterling sat, the atmosphere had turned to ice. The tycoon sat frozen, gripping the flimsy receipt so tightly it crumpled in his hand. The veins on the back of his hand bulged. The eyes that were once razor-sharp now brimmed with a rare, raw panic. Guests began to whisper. A businesswoman furrowed her brow. An old judge leaned toward his companion and muttered, "What's wrong with him?" Ethan stood rigid beside the table, the silver tray in his hands suddenly heavy as stone. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on him. But most of all, he felt Arthur's eyes locked onto him, trembling, eyes that seemed to recognize something, eyes that seemed to beg 1,000 unspoken questions. Arthur Sterling, the man who had never shown weakness, rasped out, voice hoarse, that signature. Where did you get this?" The question dropped into the room like a bomb, sharp and dissonant amidst the wine and glitter. Ethan blinked, heart pounding. He opened his mouth to explain, but a cluster of VIPs had already turned their attention toward them. A heavy-set man let out a mocking laugh. "Sterling, are you seriously asking about a receipt? Don't tell me old age has got you fretting over some messy little scribble." Laughter rippled through the room. No one understood what was happening. They just saw a powerful man losing composure and a lowly waiter caught in the crossfire. Arthur's face turned red, not from the wine, but from the emotional storm within. He slammed his hand on the table. A glass shattered, sending shards flying. Silence. The room fell dead quiet. Only Arthur's ragged breathing remained, and the sound of Ethan's heart pounding like a drum. Arthur lunged forward toward Ethan. His eyes, bloodshot, burned with desperation. "Answer me! Where did you get this paper?" Ethan stammered. "Sir, it was just an old scrap. I used it to jot down an order. I didn't know." "Liar," Arthur roared. "This isn't just some scrap. This belonged to Elena." The name echoed through the room, falling into the heavy silence like a stone in still water. The guests exchanged bewildered glances. Never, not in interviews, not in gossip columns, had Arthur Sterling ever mentioned a woman outside of business associates or his ex-wife. Ethan stood frozen. Elena. That name. It had never come up in any of his family stories, and yet something in his chest clenched an ache, sharp and sudden, like brushing up against a sorrow both distant and strangely familiar. Arthur shot up from his seat, the elegant chair toppling behind him. He lunged forward, seizing Ethan by the wrist, his voice cracking. "Tell me, who gave this to you? Who?" The entire room reeled. The billionaire tycoon clutching a nameless waiter like a drowning man reaching for air. The restaurant manager rushed over. "Mr. Sterling, please calm down. He's just an employee." Arthur spun around, voice like thunder. "Shut up! You don't understand!" He yanked Ethan closer, breathing hard. "What is your connection to Elena Morales? Tell me." The murmurs in the room grew louder. Several guests began pulling out their phones, recording the rare spectacle. Flashes flickered across the walls like lightning. Ethan felt the blood rush to his face. He didn't know who Elena Morales was. He didn't understand why a receipt had sent this billionaire into a frenzy. But one thing he did know, he was being humiliated, turned into a spectacle in front of hundreds of eyes. I don't know," Ethan blurted, his voice cracking. "Please, let go." Arthur stared into his eyes, and for a fleeting second, he saw something familiar. Those eyes, resilient, wounded, haunted, looked exactly like Elena's. Arthur staggered, releasing Ethan's wrist and stepping back. But just then a cold, cutting voice rang out. It was Victor Langdon, Arthur's longtime rival, also present at the event. He smirked. "Well, isn't this something, the mighty Sterling unraveling over a waiter?" A few opportunistic guests chuckled, their laughter sharp and shallow. Arthur's fists clenched. Rage, shame, and decades-old pain swirled into a storm inside his chest. Ethan, caught in the eye of that storm, felt completely exposed. All he wanted was to disappear. But then Lily flashed through his mind. He couldn't lose this job. He couldn't let this moment destroy everything they'd worked so hard to survive. Arthur, voice hoarse and trembling, pointed at Ethan. "You're connected to Elena. I see it in your eyes. You can't deny it." Ethan reeled. He gripped the silver tray tighter and blurted out, "I don't even know who she is. All I know is, my mother's name is Isabella Reed." Arthur froze. The room fell eerily silent, as if sound itself had vanished. Isabella Reed. The name echoed through Arthur's mind like a funeral bell. Elena, the woman he loved, had once mentioned that name in a lost letter. "If you ever still think of me, look for this name." Arthur's eyes widened. His hands trembled. He whispered, "Isabella, my God." But before the silence could settle, Victor Langdon cut in, his voice laced with mockery. A tragic love story from 40 years ago, all resurrected by a receipt. How theatrical. Or maybe you're just losing it, Sterling. Laughter erupted across the room. Arthur bowed, his head, shoulders heavy, bearing the weight of decades. Ethan, still standing in the center of it all, felt something deep and primal stir inside him, a truth just beneath the surface, a secret. And somehow, it had everything to do with him. The manager pulled Ethan aside, whispering urgently, "You need to apologize, right now, or it's over. That man can ruin your entire life." Ethan bit his lip. He hadn't done anything wrong. But if he didn't bow his head, he'd lose his job. His sister would lose her tuition. His entire world could fall apart. Arthur's voice cut through the tension again, eyes burning with something far deeper than rage. "Apologize to me, or are you apologizing for hiding the truth?" The question struck like a blade. Ethan shook his head, helpless. "I don't know anything. I'm just a waiter," Arthur shouted, voice cracking. "No. You're not just a waiter." The silence that followed stretched long and taut. Every eye in the room was locked on the two of them, a trembling tycoon on the edge and a frightened young man caught in a storm not of his making. Ethan felt like he was drowning. He wanted to run to escape this chaos, but Arthur's gaze held him in place. And in those eyes, Ethan saw more than anger. He saw pain. He saw regret. And something else, something haunting. As if Arthur was looking at him and seeing the ghost of someone he'd lost. Victor Langdon crossed his arms, his voice booming. If Sterling wants the truth, then let the kid prove it. Let's see what makes him so special. A cruel idea flickered in the minds of several guests. A woman scoffed, smirking, "Yes, let him perform. Let's see if he's really worth all this drama." The murmurs spread like ripples in water. Arthur turned back to Ethan, his voice breaking. "You! Do you know how to play?" Ethan froze. He thought of the old guitar his mother kept of the nights she strummed melancholic melodies before quietly weeping. He'd never dared play in front of anyone. But now hundreds of eyes bore down on him like knives waiting to see him stumble. The manager rushed in, flustered. "Sir, this isn't appropriate." Arthur cut him off, voice like a command. "Bring the guitar. Now." A staff member scrambled away and returned moments later carrying the wooden guitar usually displayed in a corner of the hall. The room erupted into claps and cheers. They didn't care about the truth. They wanted a spectacle, something to laugh about later over dessert. Ethan stood frozen. He understood this was a dead end. If he refused, he'd be humiliated, fired, and everything he and Lily had worked for would crumble. But if he agreed, he would bare his soul in front of a crowd that saw him as nothing. Arthur's eyes locked onto his pleading, demanding, desperate. "Play, please, for me, for Elena." The guitar was placed into Ethan's hands. The wood was cold, the strings dry and rough beneath his trembling fingers. The room fell silent, waiting. The whispers died off. Only the sound of breath remained tense, shallow, expectant. Arthur stood across from him, eyes glistening with tears, one hand clutching the crumpled receipt like a lifeline to a memory he couldn't afford to lose. Ethan took a deep breath, and in that breath, the past came flooding in his mother Isabella with her tired smile and unyielding eyes. The soft strumming of her guitar echoing through their tiny apartment, and always woven into every melody a single recurring tune, simple, aching, unforgettable. He placed his fingers on the strings. A sound rang out low, raw, imperfect, but real. The entire room held its breath. Arthur Sterling closed his eyes, and in that moment he knew the truth was coming, and it had a melody. Ethan's fingers touched the strings. The first note rang out sharp, a little rough, but then slowly the melody began to flow. It wasn't a well-known song, not the kind of piece you'd hear in a glamorous ballroom. It was something simpler, folk-like, slow and tender like a whisper from another world. At first the crowd chuckled smug in their expectations, but the guitar quickly silenced them. There was something haunting in the tune, unrefined but steeped in melancholy. It felt like wind slipping through a cracked window on a winter night. Arthur Sterling sat frozen. His whole body trembled, his eyes blurred with tears. "That song," he whispered, barely breathing. Only Elena knew it, and the memories came flooding in. The tiny Brooklyn apartment. Elena, hair falling gently over her shoulders, sitting by the window, guitar in her lap, softly humming that same melody. Arthur, young and in love, sitting beside her, lost in the sound. She had said, "If you ever lose your way, remember this tune. It'll lead you home." And now, 40 years later, that melody was rising again from the hands of a waiter. An elderly guest murmured under his breath, I've heard this before. Years ago, at an art exhibit in Queens, a poor painter played it there." Ethan kept playing, eyes shut tight, as if guided by a memory that didn't belong to him. As the melody reached the refrain, his voice rose gently. Not quite singing, just a quiet hum of nonsensical syllables, the same ones his mother used to murmur when she lulled him to sleep. Arthur collapsed into his chair, shoulders trembling. He whispered as if to no one but himself, "That's her lullaby." The room fell utterly still. No more laughter, no more whispers. Only the sound of a guitar, a fragile voice humming, and a mystery slowly unraveling in plain sight. The music came to a halt. Ethan opened his eyes. In front of him, Arthur was staring, searching his face as though trying to see through every feature, every line. "You..." Arthur's voice was raspy, broken. "What's your mother's name?" Ethan hesitated. A chill ran down his spine. Isabella Reed." Arthur staggered to his feet. A name buried for 40 years had just resurfaced. His hand, trembling, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a faded photograph, worn and soft at the edges, from years of being carried like a curse he could never shake. In the photo, a young Elena smiling radiantly. Beside her, a little girl, 6 or 7, Isabella. Arthur held the photo out in front of Ethan. The crowd held its breath. This is your mother." And his finger trembled as it pointed to Elena. "This is the woman I loved and lost forever." Ethan froze. The world tilted. "No, that's not possible." Arthur looked into his eyes as if seeing through decades, through blood, through pain. Tears rolled down his cheeks. "Ethan, you are Elena's son. You're my son." The crowd gasped. Camera shutters clicked. Whispers mixed with stunned silence and shallow breaths. Victor Langdon broke it. First voice laced with disdain. "What a performance!" "Sterling." A waiter suddenly revealed, "As your long-lost son. Are we really supposed to believe this theatrical nonsense?" Arthur clenched his fist, but this time he didn't shout. He quietly unfolded the crumpled receipt and held it up for all to see. In the corner, though, faded, the words were still legible, "Elena Morales. For Arthur, if we never meet again." A signature. A final message. The last trace of the woman he lost. Then Arthur reached into his wallet and pulled out a stack of aged, yellowed papers. Letters he'd discovered years ago in a long-abandoned apartment. Unsent. Unread. Among them, one stood out. "To my daughter Isabella. If I cannot see Arthur again, keep this letter. Maybe one day he will recognize you." Arthur held the trembling letters high before the room. His voice, though rough and strained, rang with certainty. "This isn't theater. This is truth. This is blood. This is love. This is my past, and he is the part of it I lost." Ethan staggered back, vision swimming. "No, I'm just a waiter. My mother she never told me." He collapsed into a chair, clutching his head. Fragments of memory came rushing back. The nights his mother wept silently while strumming the old guitar. The letters she kept locked away in a wooden box. Her quiet insistence that he never forget that song. And suddenly he understood. She had waited. She had hoped. But in the end, she had let go. And unknowingly, he had carried that memory within him all along. Tears welled up and spilled over. He looked up at Arthur, voice choked with grief. If what you're saying is true, why did my mother have to die in silence? Why did we have to grow up in poverty all these years?" Arthur swayed. That question pierced him like a blade. He had no answer. Only the crushing weight of regret that had grown heavier with every passing year. The atmosphere in the room shifted. What was once mockery had fallen into silence. What had been curiosity turned to quiet empathy. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes, whispering, "How heartbreaking." A younger man murmured beside her, He's never cried in public before." Victor Langdon opened his mouth ready to throw another barb, but the stares now turned toward him were different. No one was laughing anymore. They all looked toward Arthur and Ethan. Two men from opposite worlds, now standing on the fragile edge of a painful, undeniable truth. Arthur stepped forward and knelt in front of Ethan, a gesture no one had ever seen from him. The entire room held its breath. "Ethan, forgive me. I failed your mother. I don't want to fail you." His voice cracked. His trembling hand reached out gently, wrapping around Ethan's calloused one. Ethan sat still, a storm raging inside him. Anger, grief, and something else, something strange and rising, an aching pull of connection. He thought of Lily, his sister, the only person he had left. He looked at Arthur, eyes blurred with tears. "If you're truly my father, then prove it. Not with papers, not with money, but by protecting us from the very world you helped create." Arthur nodded, tears rolling freely down his face. "I swear." A round of applause broke out, not from the gawking onlookers, but from a quiet corner of the room. It came from Martha, Arthur's elderly housekeeper. She had served the Sterling family for over 50 years. Her voice was rough, trembling as she stepped forward. "I knew. I saw Elena when she was pregnant. Then she disappeared. I didn't say anything. I was afraid. Afraid of what it might do to this family. But now the truth is out." The room shook with the weight of her words. That testimony, simple, honest, was the final blow. It shattered every remaining doubt. Arthur collapsed, sobbing openly. Ethan sat frozen, the storm inside him stilled. But deep in his heart, he knew. His life had changed forever. In the crowd, Victor Langdon pressed his lips into a tight line. This moment, this spectacle should have ruined Arthur, but instead it transformed him. It stripped away the cold mask of a tycoon and revealed a man, a father, a heart, and the audience. They loved it. Victor clenched his jaw. The battle wasn't over. But for Ethan, a door had just opened, a door leading to the truth, and to a destiny he never imagined. The grand hall felt frozen in time. The chandeliers still glowed, the wine still shimmered in crystal glasses. But no one cared anymore. All eyes were fixed on the three figures at the center: Arthur Sterling, his eyes rimmed red with tears; Ethan, the waiter, still shaking from the shock of it all; and Victor Langdon, his expression, dark lips curled into a venomous smile. Victor took a single step forward, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. He clapped slowly, deliberately. The sound echoed awkwardly through the hushed room, truly touching Arthur, utterly theatrical, a secret air, a long-lost love, old letters. It's practically a Hollywood screenplay. His voice was dripping with sarcasm, every syllable sharp as a blade. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some sighed, some shook their heads, some looked at him with quiet contempt. But Victor didn't care. He stepped closer now, standing face to face with Arthur. His tone dropped low and cold. "But this city, it isn't ruled by lullabies and lost romances. It's ruled by power and fear." Arthur lifted his head. His eyes, once misted with grief, now flashed with fire. "And it's fear that destroyed you, Victor." Victor narrowed his eyes and pulled a stack of papers from his leather briefcase. With a sharp flick, he flung them into the air. The documents scattered like dead leaves fluttering down across the marble floor. Here Victor roared, voice gleaming with malice. "Proof that Ethan Reed is a fraud, a penniless waiter pretending to be Sterling's heir just to steal his fortune." The room erupted in murmurs. Some guests bent down to pick up the papers, fragmented photocopies, doctored receipts, falsified statements from paid-off witnesses. A smear campaign dressed up as evidence. Arthur stood silent, but Ethan stepped forward. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with clarity. "Mr. Langdon," he said firmly, "you can forge documents, you can buy off witnesses, but you can't buy music, and you can't buy memory." Then Ethan raised a small silver locket. The room fell still. He opened it, tilting it just enough for the chandelier's light to glint off the old faded photograph inside. A young Elena, her dark hair flowing, smiling brightly in the arms of a younger Arthur. Etched beside them, barely visible, the words, "To Arthur, my eternal love." Elena. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. The receipt. The letter. And now, the locket. Piece by piece, the puzzle fit together, undeniable, irrefutable. Victor's web of lies unraveled before everyone's eyes. Arthur stepped beside Ethan, gripping his shoulder tightly. His voice thundered, "This is my son, my blood, and no one, not even you, can take that away from us." Victor gave a cold, bitter chuckle, but his voice lost its swagger, tightening like a wire. "You think a few sentimental trinkets can change everything? Arthur, have you forgotten? I kept Sterling Industries from crumbling when you fell apart after Elena left. I built this empire in the shadows while you drowned in your grief. Without me, you're nothing." Arthur narrowed his eyes. Then slowly, deliberately, he pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. He handed it to Martha, the longtime housekeeper, her hands trembling as she plugged it into the large screen behind the stage. A moment later, audio recordings began to play, Victor's unmistakable voice echoing through the hall. "Wipe every record tied to Elena Morales. Don't let Arthur find a thing. What he needs is power, not some poor woman." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs exploded into a wave of shocked whispers. Victor turned pale. Arthur stepped forward, his voice rising, not with sorrow this time, but righteous fury. You destroyed my life. You erased Elena. You tore my son away from me. And for 40 years you sat on a throne built from blood and betrayal." Victor lunged forward, grabbing Arthur by the collar. "You're weak, Arthur. You let your emotions control you. You've always needed me." But Ethan was already there, stepping between them, shoving Victor's hand away. His eyes burned with defiance. "No. He doesn't need you, and neither do I." Ethan turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out loud and clear. "I don't want money. I don't care about inheritance. All I ever wanted was the truth. And the truth is, Victor Langdon is a liar. He buried an innocent woman to steal power. For years, he's manipulated all of us." The room erupted. Several longtime shareholders exchanged looks, nodding slowly, the haze lifting from their eyes. For the first time, they saw Victor not as a powerful force to fear, but as the manipulator he truly was. And they were done being controlled. Victor tried to argue, his voice rising in desperation, but a wave of shouting drowned him out. "I lost millions because of his advice. He threatened us into signing those contracts. All these years we were just his puppets." The voices multiplied, sharp and angry. Victor stumbled back, panic in his eyes. He looked around, searching for support for anyone, but there was no one left on his side. Arthur stepped forward, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Victor Langdon, your time is over." Applause broke out. Sporadic at first, then swelling, building into a storm. The entire room, those who once bowed to Victor, now rose, erupting into thunderous applause for Arthur and Ethan. Victor screamed, his voice ragged and lost beneath the roar. "No, this can't be happening. I control this city. Without me, there's nothing." But no one listened. He was finished. He had lost everything. Arthur pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, tears streaming freely down his face. "My son, I'm so sorry. For 40 years I let you grow up in struggle, in silence. But from this day forward, no one will ever come between us again." Ethan choked back a sob, but for the first time he let himself lean into his father's arms. Let himself be held, be seen. The crowd watched, deeply moved, many with tears in their eyes. And under the glow of the chandeliers, Victor Langdon, once the most feared man in the room, was escorted out, disgraced and broken. At the heart of it all stood Arthur and Ethan, two generations once lost to each other, now reunited at last. The next morning, New York gleamed with an unusual clarity. The glass towers reflected a soft golden light no longer shadowed by the drama of the night before. The news spread quickly. Victor Langdon had been officially stripped of all power within the corporation, now under investigation for fraud and obstruction. Headlines called it, "The Night the Langdon Empire Crumbled." But for Arthur Sterling, it wasn't just a business victory. It was a rebirth. He sat by the window in his penthouse watching the city awaken. In his weathered eyes, something new flickered, peace. Beside him, Ethan approached with a tray of coffee. Not as a waiter, not as an outsider, but as a son. Arthur smiled, a rare, genuine smile the press had never captured. "Sit, son. I've spent too many years not seeing you. Let me make up for them." Ethan hesitated, then slowly took a seat. In silence, they watched the sunrise together, a new beginning for both of them. 1 week later, at the old Sterling estate, Arthur hosted a small gathering. There was no grandeur, no wealthy moguls, just a simple, intimate meal. The guests, not power brokers or socialites, but the very people once invisible in this palace of power, the gardener, old Martha, the housekeeper, the aging chef. And now they all sat at the same table. Amid the modest dishes sat a small wooden box. Arthur placed it in front of Ethan. "These are what remain of your mother, Elena. I kept them all these years like a wound I never dared to touch. But today, I think it's time they belong to you." Ethan slowly opened the box. Inside were a few handwritten letters, a faded silk scarf, and an old photo, Elena holding a newborn baby boy. Him. Tears welled up. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked up the photo, feeling in that moment like he was being held again by the mother he never truly got to remember. Arthur gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder. His eyes glistened. "I lost her, but I swear I will never lose you." The scene cuts to Ethan's old apartment in Brooklyn, a space filled with worn furniture memories and quiet sacrifice. Then a new frame Lily, the younger sister Ethan, had spent his entire youth protecting, now stepping through the grand doors of the Sterling estate. She stood frozen at the base of the marble staircase, overwhelmed. But then Arthur approached gently, warmly, and bent slightly to meet her eyes. "You must be Lily. Please make this your home. From today forward, you don't just have a brother. You have a father and a family." Lily broke into tears, rushing into Arthur's arms. She held him tightly, the years of struggle dissolving in that single embrace. Ethan stood beside them, his face illuminated not by wealth but by something far rarer. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. Several months later, a special event took place. The official announcement of the heir to the Sterling Empire. Hundreds of reporters packed the grand hall shoulder to shoulder. Everyone braced for the usual cold declarations, numbers, stocks, corporate strategy. But when Arthur Sterling stepped onto the stage, he didn't speak of profits or projects. He told a story about a receipt, an old signature, and a son he thought he had lost. His voice was hoarse with emotion. "I used to believe that a life's greatest worth came from power and wealth. But that night, under the weight of humiliation and truth, I realized something else. The greatest value in life lies in family. In love we thought was lost, but was always waiting to be found." Then Arthur placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder and turned to the cameras. "This is my son, Ethan Sterling. Not just by blood, but as living proof that truth always finds its way back no matter how long it's been buried." The entire room rose to their feet. Thunderous applause erupted. Camera flashes ignited like fireworks. And standing side by side, father and son, they weren't symbols of wealth or legacy. They were two souls reunited, a family made whole. Meanwhile, Victor Langdon faced the full weight of his consequences. The shareholders turned their backs. The media dug deep, exposing every crooked deal, every buried secret. His schemes were plastered across headlines. The man who once commanded storms with a whisper now stumbled into court with trembling hands and hollow eyes. No one pitied him, because what Victor lost wasn't just a company, he had lost his humanity long ago. In sharp contrast, Arthur and Ethan walked forward together, not just into the future of a corporation, but into the future of a reborn family. On their final night in the estate, Ethan stepped into the long-forgotten music room, its corners thick with dust and memory. In the far corner sat an old piano, silent for decades. He took a seat, placing his trembling fingers on the keys. Outside the doorway, Arthur froze. The first notes drifted into the hallway, soft, familiar. It wasn't a grand or dramatic piece. It was a song Ethan's mother used to play, Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody echoed through the empty halls, sweeping away shadows, washing clean the bitterness of the past. Arthur closed his eyes, and for a moment he could see Elena again, smiling, her hair dancing in the breeze. When the final note faded, Arthur stepped into the room and wrapped his arms around Ethan. No words were needed. Only the music remained, the one language that could finally bridge two hearts separated for a lifetime, now beating as one. The film closes on a quiet image: Arthur, Ethan, and Lily sitting together at a simple dinner table. No champagne, no extravagant dishes, just a plate of homemade spaghetti cooked by Ethan himself. And yet laughter fills the room, light and genuine, melting every distance that once stood between them. The camera slowly pulls back. A warm voiceover begins. Sometimes the smallest moments, those that seem meaningless, carry the power to change a life forever. A mistaken receipt, an old signature, a buried secret. All can become bridges that lead us home again. Money fades, power passes. But family, no matter how long it's been broken, remains the melody that waits quietly for us to find it again. The screen slowly fades to black. A line appears. If it were you, would you have the courage to forgive and open your heart to a loved one lost for years? Share your thoughts in the comments. A gentle piano melody begins to play, soft, reflective. And with it, the story ends, leaving behind a lingering ache and a quiet warmth in the hearts of those who watched.